So the Kerbal Space Program Making History expansion allows us to recreate some really interesting space missions, such as a docking between the Gemini spacecraft and the Agena target vehicle, which I've decided to recreate here. Now, there were a handful of missions in which the Gemini spacecraft, or Gemini as I always say, spacecraft rendezvoused with the Agena target vehicle. But for this one, I chose to more so mimic Gemini 11 because I think that one's the most interesting. So first of all, we're going to be launching the Agena target vehicle into orbit. The Agena target vehicle was basically a testing article that was used to demonstrate orbital rendezvous and docking capabilities in the Gemini program, which of course would be later implemented into the Apollo program. And the Agena target vehicle was basically a modified Agena D upper stage that included a docking port and a high-gain antenna. It was launched on top of an Atlas booster, the very same rocket that had launched astronauts into orbit just a couple of years prior. So here's the upper stage ignition. So the Atlas has done its job. This is the Agena rocket stage boosting the target vehicle into orbit. Now my goal is to go for about a 75 by 75 kilometer orbit. Of course, everything is scaled down in Kerbal Space Program, so everything's a little bit smaller. Kerbin is a lot smaller than Earth. But I place the Agena target vehicle into orbit, and I wait until I achieve orbit first before I ditch the fairing. But my goal was to get about a 75 by 75 orbit, which gives us a nice target. Now, this is a mission that requires two launches. We launch the target vehicle first, and then we launch Gemini second. And I chose for Valentina and Bob to be the crew members of this mission. What's interesting is that the Agena target vehicle was launched a total of 7 times. It failed to achieve orbit on 3 separate occasions, like on Gemini 6, which was supposed to be the first ever rendezvous of the Gemini spacecraft and the Agena target vehicle, but the Agena failed to achieve orbit. So instead, they decided to make Gemini 6 and 7 rendezvous, which ended up being a bit of a blessing in disguise, actually. And then Gemini 8 was the first mission to successfully dock with the Agena. However, due to a thruster failure on the Gemini spacecraft, which nearly ruined the entire mission, they had to abort and come back down early. Neil Armstrong was the commander of that mission. As you see now, the target vehicle is in position, it's done, and now our goal is to launch Gemini. So we're going to wait until the target vehicle flies roughly right there, just about overhead. Here's the Titan II GLV. It was a intercontinental ballistic missile that was retrofitted, similarly to the Atlas, to launch astronauts. Now this rocket is a little slow to get off the pad, but this was a very good recreation of the vehicle. So now Valentina and Bob are going to be launched into orbit. So Gemini 9 was the third attempt at launching the Agena target vehicle, and it failed to achieve orbit. Yet again, there was an issue with the Atlas booster. So instead, they launched a backup augmented docking targeting adapter, which was a bit of a scaled-down version, and Gemini 9 successfully rendezvoused with it, but no docking could be performed because the fairing failed to deploy. They had a lot of trouble with this, you know. But Gemini 10, 11, and 12 went flawlessly. Starting with Gemini 10, they rendezvoused with the target vehicle, docked, and then they managed to reignite the engine on the Agena, and it boosted Gemini up to an altitude of about 412 nautical miles, or about 760 kilometers. On Gemini 11, which is the mission that I mostly tried to recreate, you can see it right there. That's the target vehicle, that purple box you see. That's the target vehicle. But now the Titan II is in orbit, and now I'm going to begin to to tinker with the maneuver node to adjust our orbit so we can bring the two spacecraft close together. Now, at this point, the two spacecraft are going to be less than about 300 meters away from each other. So this is like a direct ascent rendezvous, which is exactly what Gemini 11 did. The Gemini spacecraft managed to rendezvous with it shortly before completing its first orbit, which is exactly what I did right here. It ended up working out pretty perfectly. I didn't really intend it to be that way. So that green box at the top, that's the target vehicle, and we are slowly going to catch up to it. Now, one thing I did in Kerbal Space Program that did not happen in real life, I used the upper stage of the Titan II, because it has a bit of fuel left, to slow us down. So now we're getting really close to the target vehicle. I burned the upper stage just to slow us down. As you can see, we're about 25 meters per second faster than the target vehicle, and I burned the engine just to slow ourselves down as we make really good contact, which of course they didn't do that in real life. They would just use the thrusters on the Gemini spacecraft. But now look at that. We've got a really good visual on the target vehicle. I go ahead and separate the spacecraft from the upper stage, and now I go ahead and prepare to dock. or at least do a close approach and station keep first. So as I mentioned, I'm trying to recreate more closely Gemini 11. Out of the window, look at that. We have a beautiful visual of the target vehicle. Isn't that wonderful? This was a beautiful rendezvous. Like, I did a direct descent. We got very, very close, and now we get to station keep a little bit. We get to see a great view of the target vehicle. And I think this is just wonderful. Like, I didn't intend on doing it this way. It just brilliantly worked out. So, complete accident. But hey, that's wonderful. But now I'm going to maneuver the Gemini spacecraft with the RCS thrusters, and I'm going to prepare to dock. I imagine Valentina is probably controlling this thing because, she is a pilot after all. But the docking and the maneuverability was completely manually performed. Of course, the spacecraft couldn't do it itself. But now we are going to maneuver the spacecraft to being directly in front of the target vehicle so we can go ahead and prepare for docking. See, the rendezvous has already been performed, and I'm thinking I want to go ahead and do a second docking, maybe do a third if I can, maybe drift away a little bit and come back. Now, Gemini 11 managed to reignite the Agena engine, and it boosted the Gemini spacecraft to an altitude of 739 miles, or 1,370 kilometers, somewhere around there. And they even had a tether experiment where they attached the two spacecraft with a tether that was about 100 foot long, or 100 feet long. And it helped to create artificial gravity because they basically rotated the two spacecraft, and it created just a tiny little bit of gravitational pull between the two spacecraft, and it allowed the spacecraft to remain stable without having to use any minor propellant. But unfortunately, we cannot do the tether experiment in this game because they don't have a tether system. It's very unfortunate, but whatever. But we are docked now. Look at how beautiful that is, and look at our crew inside the capsule. I love the interior of the Gemini spacecraft. It looks so cool. But we see our two astronauts probably thinking, yeah, that was great. We successfully docked. We rendezvoused with the target vehicle, and we've learned some valuable information. And we did a direct ascent rendezvous, which I was particularly proud of. So now as we complete about half an orbit, we go around across the terminator to the lit side of the Earth. We're going to undock and then very quickly use our thrusters to slow ourselves down and to maneuver ourselves towards the docking port, and we are going to redock with the Agena target vehicle. In real life, Gemini 11 docked like 4 different times, and then they did a 5th rendezvous, which was unplanned, just because they had enough fuel, and they said, yeah, let's go back. But there we go. That's our second docking, which we're going to do a total of 3 in this mission. And now we are preparing to boost the spacecraft with the Agena target vehicle's engines. Of course, this happened in real life as well. Particularly for Gemini 11, the Agena engine boosted the Gemini spacecraft to an altitude of about 740 miles, which is about 1,360 kilometers-ish. So they got fairly high up there. At the time, it was the furthest humans had ever been from Earth. And the crew members, Dick Gordon and Pete Conrad, who later flew together on Apollo 12, commented that you could see the entire Earth from their position. Like, you could see the entire planet from about 700 miles up. That must have been fascinating. Of course, the altitude record would be annihilated by the Apollo program shortly. But as you see, we've boosted the Gemini spacecraft up to about 400 kilometers. Now, in KSP, everything is scaled down a bit. In real life, they went up to 1,300, about 60 kilometers. But I decided to do 400 because I think, based on how this game is scaled, this is most likely accurate, or at least just what I decided upon. So I decided to do 2 orbits like this, and then similar to the real mission, we're going to use the Agena engine again to lower our orbit roughly back to where it was. Now look at that. You get a beautiful view of the Earth out of the window. Just marvelous. That must have been a fascinating sight to see in real life. But now we're going to go ahead and complete yet another orbit and prepare to lower our apoaps. So in the real Gemini program, I believe their orbit after boosting was like 185 miles by about 750 miles, something like that. And then they lowered it back down to 185 by about 185. It was nearly circular, not perfectly circular, but almost. So they used the engine yet again to lower the apoaps back to a circular orbit. On Gemini 12, which was the final mission of the Gemini program before they swapped back over, they switched over to Apollo, the Agena engine failed to reignite. So they were not able to boost the orbit, but they did do the tether and the rendezvous, and I guess that's what was most important. So now we've used the Agena engine to lower our apoapse, and now we are in a nearly circular orbit, just like Gemini 11 was in real life. Now, I understand that NASA pronounced it Gemini, but I say Gemini. That's just what I say. Now, I went ahead and undocked with the target vehicle here, the ATV, and my goal is we're just going to be orbiting the Earth. We're going to separate the two spacecraft and just go our own separate ways. And now we're going to drift apart in orbit, and I decided that I would burn the thrusters to slow myself down, which would allow the ATV to catch up to me. And this is what I did to prepare for our third docking. So technically this isn't another rendezvous because it didn't go too far away, but I decided to approach the vehicle yet again, trying to sort of mimic the fifth rendezvous and docking that Gemini did. I don't know if they docked the fifth time, but they did rendezvous. And now we get to perform station keeping, and we get to observe the target vehicle yet again. And now in this mission, we prepare for our third and final docking with the Agena target vehicle. And then after this, we're going to prepare for re-entry. We're going to splash down and come back to Earth, or at least to the surface of the Earth. So now everything's lined up. We're going to make sure we're going at a decent speed. And yet again, we're going to be docking with the target vehicle. So we're going to let this play out in real time because most of this footage is sped up. We slowly approach and capture. How beautiful is that? So of course, everything that was learned in Gemini, also Mercury, Surveyor, Ranger, Lunar Orbiter, all of that directly contributed to the Apollo program, but orbital rendezvous was the one thing that they really needed to figure out because the lunar lander would fly back into lunar orbit and rendezvous with the command and service module of the orbiting spacecraft. But now we prepare to say goodbye to the targeting vehicle. Farewell, Agena. We are now using our thrusters to push ourselves away. We have undocked for the final time from Agena, and now the crew is prepared to return home after a very, very successful mission. We did all kinds of things. We docked, we raised our orbit, we docked again, did another rendezvous. Unfortunately, we cannot replicate the tether experiment. So now I'm using the thrusters on the Gemini spacecraft to deorbit. In this game, it's now 100% accurate. In real life, the Gemini spacecraft would jettison its instrument module, and then it had retro rockets that would fire, and it would slow it down just enough to fall back to Earth. Unfortunately, in this game, we just have to deal with the RCS thrusters, but it works, so whatever. Now we jettison the service module, and we prepare to return home. The crew's job is done. Their day is over. All they have to do now is just wait. So the Gemini spacecraft is now falling back towards the Earth, and I tried to set the re-entry to be as close to the space center as possible. I'm generally pretty good at getting pretty close to the space station. And now we are re-entering. You can see the plasma. Let's go inside the capsule. This is what Valentina and Bob would see. Look at that plasma fireball building up around the cabin, getting up to 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. But as they begin to go through the atmosphere, drag, air resistance will cause the spacecraft to slow down. There's the Space Center right there. That's where we launched from. And now we go into the more dense parts of the Earth's atmosphere to the point where we're slowing down constantly. Here come the drag chutes. Beautiful. And now underneath the drag chutes, we fall down, gradually slowing our rate of descent as the main chutes deploy. And once the main chutes are out, we no longer have to worry about, hey, is this going to work properly? Because guess what? We splash down safely, and Valentina and Bob can shake hands and congratulate each other on a successful, wonderful mission. There's Valentina, there's Bob, our crew members, and this was a really, really awesome mission.